I'm Richard Klein. I have 3 degrees in mechanical engineering. I graduated from Purdue University with a doctorate in mechanical engineering. My specialization is what is called feedback control systems, and that really makes me, I'm qualified to say that I'm an applied mathematician, and I'm also qualified to say that I'm a rocket scientist. That if you want to shoot a rocket off and hit a target or whatever else you're doing with that rocket or going into space, you need to do 2 things. You need to propel the rocket, and you then also need to guide the rocket. My specialization was on the guidance side of rocket science. I ended up being a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Illinois. And one of the wonderful things about being an academic and a professor is that I'm afforded 2 things. I'm afforded the opportunity uh, to be given respect and paid well. I mean, adequately in life. I'm not rich, I'm not poor, but a very pleasant living. And the second thing about being a professor is that I'm in the company of intelligent, bright students in a world of optimism, and that I'm free to do whatever I want. In teaching, I handled that in the classroom, but in terms of research, I was free then to pick and choose what I wanted to do. Early on in my career at the University of Illinois, I was very much challenged with by a colleague. A colleague came to me and he said, Richard, why don't you do something meaningful other than just studying equations and esoterics of mathematics and so on? And at that time, this colleague was aware of the fact that the World Trade, not the World Trade Center, but the tall buildings were then being erected. Buildings had changed their methodology of being built. We know, for example, that in 1930, 31 to be exact, and then a little earlier in 1928 or so, that the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were erected in New York City. And typical of those buildings in the 1930s, they were largely masonry. They did have some steel framing, but the steel framing was um, encapsulated in concrete and masonry and brick and concrete. And as a result, the buildings were very stiff and stout. For example, the world may not recall this, but in the summer of 1945, a B-25 bomber collided with the Empire State Building of New York. And it did virtually no damage to the building because the bomber or the aircraft did not have the ability to impact or damage the Empire State Building. As decades went by, practices changed in civil engineering and how we design and construct buildings, that steel became the dominant um, ingredient or structural member in building a tall building, and then they would enclose the building with paneling or what's called cladding. And so by about in the middle 1960s, at this point, a number of buildings were being erected and a new era came about in terms of how we would build buildings. As buildings changed from being constructed of masonry, which is very solid, like a rock, versus steel, a steel frame structure, which is more elastic, it turns out that as a building would be subject to aerodynamic excitation that is called wind, the building would in fact shake and move and vibrate. And this caused many problems, and it's just an interesting question that the owner of a building, be a government building or a private building, they are interested in a thing called rents. And they want to keep the rents high, and they do want to dispel rumors that, oh, the building is shaking or the building is wiggling. The World Trade Center, for example, typified this new generation of buildings. And the World Trade Center is very fascinating story behind that. Few people know this, but the World Trade Center was a governmental building, and we'll see that this is very important. Uh, it was a governmental building in that it was owned, financed, conceived, and constructed by a governmental authority. And the governmental authority in that case was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was a body, a legal entity set up by Congress in the 1920s, if my memory is correct on this. It was largely the product of one very powerful man in New York City's history, and that man's name was Robert Moses. At the time of 1966, when the World Trade Center was first envisioned and they laid out the plans for it, Robert Moses at that time was fairly along in life. He was in his 70s or so. He was born in 1888 and he passed away in 1981 at approximately the age of 93. But the understand that the World Trade Center complex in New York City was owned and controlled and designed and financed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. In 1971 and 1972, I became interested in tall buildings and what we could do to stabilize them. And I, with two other colleagues, proposed a methodology. And what I actually proposed was quite radical at the time. The civil engineering and structural community never understood it then, and they still do not understand it to this day. What I did was I proposed that we put wings or little shutters or fins on the building. And what I did argue is that if we could take little wings and put them on the building and flip them open and close them and flip them open and close them, we could change the forces on the building. And if we could change the forces on the building, we could then stabilize the building. And I use the analogy, if you have a child on a swing on a playground, if you want the child to go and have a good time to be swinging, you have a very simple algorithm or decision process. Say if you were the parent or the adult with the child, when the child is going forward, that is when you push the child, and when the child is coming back, that is when you do not touch the child, and then you only coincide your pushes with the velocity going forward, and that this will keep the child going. And conversely, if it's time to go in for lunch or it's going to start raining and you want the child to stop swinging, you can very quickly arrest or stop that swing of that child, because as the child what you do is you keep pushing on the child, but you switch the timing as to when you apply the push. That is when the child is coming back, say I'm pretending that I'm the adult pushing the child. When the child comes back, that is when I push and give a retarding force. And yet when the child is going forward, I do nothing. And what I proposed, if tall buildings are in fact wiggling in the wind, that one of the things we can do, the wind is available as a force because of pushing on that structure. I argued the fact that we could in fact put little, I used the word Venetian blinds at the time, or little fins that would go out, and we could, like a bird's feather or a bird's wing, we could then take and put the wing on and then get a push in a certain direction. But I always said we want to arrest the motion. Therefore, I said whenever the building is swaying into the wind, that's when we will apply that finger or that push on the building. And when the building is coming back, we're going with the wind, that's when we don't do the pushing. And with two colleagues and myself, Dr. Chris Casano and Dr. James Stuckel, we published a paper, actually several papers, but the dominant paper we published I presented that paper in December of 1970, technically, correction. I presented that paper in November of 1972 at the ASME Winter Annual Meeting in New York City. And it was because of that paper appeared that I later received contact from the structural engineers of the World Trade Center. And the structural engineers contacted me about 2 years later, 2 or 3 years later. It was in the fall of 1975. And they basically said to me in communications, Dr. Klein, we would like to consult with you or have you visit the World Trade Center. And so then on December 23rd of 1975, this is an important day in my life, I happened to be on a Christmas holiday trip to the East Coast. My parents at the time lived in Stratford, Connecticut, nearby. We means my family and I, my wife and I, we traveled to the East Coast, to New England, and then at that time, I took a day, and that day happened to be December 23rd of 1975. I took a train, in that particular case, into New York City. And I spent the day in New York City, and I got out of the train station. And then if you're familiar with New York City, you go from the train station, Grand Central. I believe it was Grand Central. And then you go a little ways by foot, and you then enter the subway, and I was then able to take the subway system down to what is called the financial district. And at the financial district, I emerged out of the subway, and their aha was the World Trade Center facility. And at that time, there were the two towers were completed and in place. I then went and met with the structural engineers of the World Trade Center on that day, December 23rd, 1975. I met with Mr. Fred Chang, professional engineer. He was a structural engineer, and he explained to me his problem. And the problem was wind related, and it was the fact that the buildings, plural, were shaking or moving. And in this particular case, what had happened was the two towers each were subject to not so much movement in the transverse or along wind direction, but what was happening with the World Trade Center towers is they were subject to a phenomenon known as vortex shedding. And it was the vortex shedding was then causing a side-to-side oscillation of the building of each of the two towers, and that oscillation, 5-second period. The next issue was that there were buildings that, depending upon the direction of the wind, there were buildings that were downstream or downwind of the World Trade Center towers. And there was an adjacent building at 22 Cortlandt Street that was a nearby building, and it was a very interesting building. It was shorter by only about 1/3 of the height of the massive towers, which were each 110 stories tall. The 5-second vortex shedding from the World Trade Center towers then was impacting this smaller building at 22 Cortlandt Street. And unfortunately, the coincidence was that the building at 22 Cortlandt Street had a natural sway period of 5 seconds. That sway period coincided with the period at which it was bombarded by these swirling vortices coming off of the World Trade Center tower. When I met with Mr. Fred Chang, he and I discussed the problem briefly. He shared with me some accelerometer recordings of the World Trade Center tower. I found those recordings extremely interesting. The World Trade Center towers, as these recordings reveal, show that the twin towers had a natural sway period of 11 seconds, but there was furthermore a second period, approximately of 5-second duration, superimposed on top of that. He had the data recorded by the elevator company, which was then given to him, and the legality and the ethics of taking the data, the elevator company was responsible for the integrity and reliability of the elevators, and they had a concern, and therefore they took the measurements, whereas Mr. Fred Chang told me, in fact, that his employer, the people who owned and operated the World Trade Center, did not authorize him or allow him, even as the structural engineer, to take any data or recordings, accelerometer recordings, on the movement of that building. I sadly or unfortunately had to tell Mr. Chang that I could not envision how my methods would be of any help to him in solving his problems with the Cortlandt Street building, but I did then ask my host, Mr. Chang, I would love to have a tour of the World Trade Center towers, and I'd love to be able to see, in particular, the 3M dampers. Because my research was involved with stabilization of tall buildings, I obviously was very interested in other methods whereby people could stabilize buildings. And at that time, there were two methods that were prominent in existence, and those methods were furthermore published in the literature. One method concerned putting a large block, or in a certain case, 2 blocks of concrete or lead or mass way up on top of the building, and it was a concept called a tune mass damper. And the second method was that, and this was applicable to the World Trade Center Twin Towers, once the towers were built, it was realized that, or understood, that the buildings were swaying, and they went to an expert, and I'll later explain who that expert was, and it was decided that they would retrofit those buildings with viscoelastic dampers. And it was the 3M company out of St. Paul, Minnesota, designed and patented and installed viscous elastic dampers in the World Trade Center towers. And he gladly understood, and we then cheerfully, we exited. We went down we were up on the upper roof of the Cortlandt Street building, Took the elevator down, we crossed the street, walked across the street, went up, and we went into the South Tower. Remember, the World Trade Center facility is consisting of two towers, Tower 1 and Tower 2. We went into the South Tower and we took the express elevator up to the 78th floor. And then from the what's called the Sky Lobby on the 78th floor, we then went up another 6, 7, 8 floors, as I recall, I believe to about the 82nd floor. And at that time, the 82nd floor was still it was undergoing interior construction, not retrofitting, but fitting out. They were putting in the ceiling lights. They were putting in the electrical wiring. They were starting to apply the wall paneling. And so that it was the interior of the 82nd floor was then open and exposed. We could see the steel beams. And that is when Mr. Chang, we went over to we went up the elevators in the center core of the building. We went up and then we, on the 82nd floor, walked to the south wall. And at that point, that is where Mr. Chang could point out and said, there are the 3M dampers. The 3M dampers are each about approximately 3 feet long, and there's a plate that is welded onto what's called the box beam. That is the support beams around the perimeter of the building. And then the damper was in a horizontal position. It was like sandwiched materials, but then it was the other end of the damper was attached to the apex of the corner of the ceiling truss. On my tour, I had asked to see these 3M dampers, and Mr. Chang showed me the dampers, and I was very pleased. It's the first time I had ever seen them in person. I had looked at papers where people had sketches of them, but I wanted to see them in person. And then my eye caught a very interesting thing, to me interesting and even alarming. I then realized and I saw that the building was nearing completion. The building was already enclosed, it was fabricated in, it was encapsulated, they were doing the wiring, they were putting in the flooring, and the one thing was missing. The thing that was missing was there was no insulation, no heat protective insulation on any of the steel structures. There was no insulation on any of the ceiling trusses, and there was no insulation on any of the vertical columns. I then asked Mr. Chang, I said, what is going on here? I was aware of the fact that steel buildings, frame buildings, were required by code to either be encapsulated in concrete or, in the absence of concrete or masonry, that they be protected by typically either wrap-on or spray-on foam insulation. And the purpose of the foam insulation is to cause the building to be resistant to fire. And Mr. Chang told me, I said, wait a minute, and I was aware that national code required that structural buildings have insulation on those beams, and I saw the building was way beyond the point you would ever do the insulation. Remember that when you, for example, do spray-on insulation, this is a very messy operation. When you go in to have when a building is being constructed, once the building is framed out and maybe the cladding is on, you then go in and you spray on this insulation, and at the light foam insulation. The insulation was not there. It was obvious that they were never going to put the insulation in, and I asked Mr. Chang why. And Mr. Chang replied to me, he said that the structural engineers of that building had requested a waiver in the code, and that they got a waiver saying that the insulation was not required in that building. Very fascinating. Then Mr. Chang went on and he gave me 5 reasons. And he said, there are 5 reasons that justify the issuance of this waiver. And the first thing he had to say, and I'm trying to remember these and possibly I may get the order a little wrong, but he basically said the following. The first thing is that this building is now equipped with sprinklers, overhead water heat sensitive sprinklers, and so that if a fire would ever break out, we will have protection against fire because of the sprinklers, number 1. Number 2, that Mr. Chang told me that because the sprinklers require water flow when they are activated, that they have sensors within the sprinkler system which will then tell them or alert a central panel or a system that there's now a fire in the building. Therefore, they will have early warning of a fire. And number 2, they will have the identification of the zone or the location within the building. The third reason that Mr. Chang gave me for the justification for the waiver was that the building would be maintained and operated with a low quantity of combustible materials. That's merely what he said. I could elaborate more on this later, but I will just say this, that basically when you have a public building and a building with employees in it, you cannot really control the contents. A secretary has a desk somewhere, an employee comes in and they want a picture of their grandchild, they're going to put the picture on the desk. And even that picture frame may be plastic, it could be combustible, it could burn. You have books, you have file cabinets, you have papers, you have drawings. You cannot control the combustibles in the building, but nonetheless, Mr. Chang told me that the quantity of combustibles would be low. That was his third reason. The fourth reason he had to say was that there would be early response by firefighting crews to put out any fire. And number five, the fifth reason he gave me was that fire would be contained locally. It was the design of the building such that if there was a fire within a building such as the World Trade Center, the fire would be contained locally because of the concrete floors and the slabs between the various floors, for example. And I find it very interesting that, and the public does not know this, but even on the day of 9/11, when those airplanes impacted those towers, the protocol within the building is if there is a fire within the building, the employee is to remain at his or her desk. And if an evacuation is required, that the evacuation will only be local within the building, not to get out of the building. Next observation is about their fire protocol rules was that in certain cases, if there was a fire within the building, you would not evacuate necessarily by going down, you would evacuate by going up, meaning you just go elsewhere in the building and everything would be fine. If you remember your history well, I did the inspection of the 82nd floor on the south side of the South Tower. And what's very interesting is that coincidental or God's hand or whatever else, that is exactly the floor and the point at which that tower was impacted by a hijacked airplane on 9/11/2001. Those were the answers. I could not reply. I mean, I could argue I had disappointments in terms of what Mr. Chang had told me. He was basically telling me that a waiver had been requested and that the waiver had been granted. I have later concluded that we were dealing with an strange situation here. I assert that that building was not subject to the inspection codes and safety codes of the City of New York. And the reason it was not subject to the codes of the City of New York is it was not a city building. It was not even a civilian building. It was a governmental-owned building, and that the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey had more authority for the control and maintenance of that building than the City of New York. And so when Mr. Chang said that they requested a waiver, it is my conclusion that he requested the waiver of himself. That is, he asked the right hand of the Port Authority, asked the left hand, gee, can I have a waiver? And they said yes. And Mr. Chang also said on the issue of insulation, he said, yes, there was some insulation on the building, but the insulation was only on the first 20 floors of the building. From the floors from number 21 on up to 110 had no insulation. And so I'm going to make the claim right now, or the assertion, that when the airplanes, the two respective airliners, were hijacked and impacted those towers on 9/11/2001, those buildings had zero chance of staying upright. All buildings can burn. That is not the question. The question as to what constitutes the rating of a building in terms of being fireproof is the length of time that the building will remain structurally sound given a certain temperature. That's so many hours of time, and when that building did not have that insulation, it did not have the time in terms of for the firefighters to respond or for the fire to burn itself out. I firmly believe that the City of New York Fire Department was under a contractual obligation to provide firefighting services to the World Trade Center tower, but the fire department inspectors had no jurisdiction in that building because it was a Port Authority building. And so when the fire crews went into those buildings on 9/11, they in fact did not know that those towers did not have insulation, fire protection, and heat insulation on those structural members. And now we can ask the question, why didn't it have the insulation? Why were they so against insulation. And it turns out it's a word called asbestos. The building construction actually was started in the 1967-1968 era. By about 1970 is when asbestos became an exceedingly shocking matter issue. And at that point, an issue because of environmental issues, an edict was issued stating that we will suspend the application of asbestos in the building. And now, yes, it's true that other fire insulation, heat insulation materials possibly existed at the time, but either one, they weren't available, or in particular, they were not certified. And because they weren't certified, what is the point? And then eventually then you have to wait and delay the construction of the building. Very costly to think of what this building is, so many acres and acres and acres of floors of commercial space in downtown New York, what it would rent for per year. And a decision was made, say, I have an idea, we'll just request a waiver. After the collapse, all sorts of people have said, well, hey, let's have a study. Let's find out what happened. Yes, they had a study. In particular, two groups of researchers went in, or investigators went in to study the building's collapse and what went wrong. And the first one was FEMA, F-E-M-A, Federal Emergency Management Agency, issued a report approximately the next spring of the next year. And then also there was a second report issued approximately 5 years later by NIST, National Institutes of Standards and Technology. And what's interesting is both of those studies were funded by acts of Congress, and both of those studies made the following statement. They both said the insulation was present. And they said, and the next thing they said that the insulation was dislodged by the impact of the airplanes hitting the building. I've made the claim that the insulation wasn't there. Obviously, the FEMA and the NIST reports say that it was there. Well, who's right and who's wrong? I have only my personal testimony. I did not take photographs that day. I took no notes whatsoever. But I do have a second way of resolving the issue so that even you can be an expert and testify in a court of law on this type of thing. After the collapse of the towers on 9/11, there have been numerous photographs published of the debris. And in particular, there was a very famous photograph, I believe, taken on behalf of FEMA, of a fireman standing in front of the pile of debris with an American flag. And the pile of debris is 30, 40, 50 feet in height. And it shows all the beams. And so you see this entire pile of twisted rubble. And I challenge you to look at that photograph and look at other photographs. There are dozens of them available publicly on the internet. And ask yourself this question: where is the insulation? And I can accept the fact that if a building collapsed mechanically, that a whole bunch of insulation got knocked and rubbed off. Sure, I can accept the fact that half of it got rubbed off. I can accept the fact that 90% of it got knocked off. But please do not tell me that 100%, 100.0000% of the insulation all got dislodged in the collapse. I don't buy it. And if you go with your microscope and you check those photographs, I challenge you to ever find any evidence of insulation. And it's also interesting about the World Trade Center because the Port Authority had then established its headquarters in the towers, within the towers themselves. And as a result, then, all sorts of records got destroyed. That is, hard to go back to the original drawings if they got destroyed in an office building that was in that tower. I thought to myself, what do I do? And the first, I must confess that I've written elsewhere in my books. My autobiography is called Dumb Dicky, but I talk about the incident when I was a child when my mother, we were told driving down the road, the windows were open, and a passing motor screamed out and said, "Your car is on fire." And my mother instantly, the car at that time was we had left a little shopping center, the car was doing 20 or 25 miles an hour. My mother then just opened her door. This is before the days of seatbelts. My two brothers and I were in the back seat. My mother was in the front. She opened the door. She bailed out. My mother has an incredible fear of fires. She's now deceased, but when I say fear of fire, it's fear of pyrophobics, and that's not being trapped in a fire. And I have inherited to some degree that fear of fire. When I was then in the World Trade Center and I saw the fact that this building had no heat protective insulation on the beams, I knew that that building was an absolute and certain fire trap. And yet I have to ask myself, what can I do about it? I have a doctorate in mechanical engineering. I'm a professor at a prestigious university, the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, but I am not a civil engineer. And furthermore, in the area of work that I'm involved in, I am not a professional engineer. I have never taken the professional engineering exam. I cannot put PE behind my name. But I had to ask myself that day, what do I do? I was in a sweat and a chill, and the one thing that I could do was I could walk out of that building and never come back. And that's what I indeed did on that day on December 23rd, 1975. I could have gone out on the street and put a sign up and said, "Fire trap, don't enter," and walk up and down the sidewalk, but I had a problem with that. And the problem was, one, I don't live in New York City, and number two, I was subject still to the codes of ethics of engineering. And ASME, American Society of Mechanical Engineers, has a certain code of ethics. And there's two canons within that listing of code of ethics that apply to me. It says, number one, you will not make any public statement unless you can do so in a proper manner, meaning that there were quite precise words they said about that statement. And the second thing would be that you will offer engineering services only in your area of expertise. That is where you have standing and recognized credentials. Because of professional ethics, I could not make a statement, and I've kept silent now for 20 years, now even since the collapse. It's been 45, almost now 46 years since I toured that building and actually saw the naked beams. And so I made the decision then just to keep quiet. Whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision, I don't know. But now that it's been 20 years since the events of 9/11, I feel that I'm under an obligation to tell my story. And I'd like to just say this, that I'm inherently a very altruistic person. I'm going to tell you a story about when I was in Boy Scouts at age 11 or 12. And it turns out that I saw an advertisement on a certain brand of chicken pot pie, and the advertisement had big letters on it saying, "No soggy undercrust." And I said, wow, that's great. I went as a kid and I bought my chicken pot pie, and I took it with me on a camping trip, and I somehow heated it up. I don't know how I did that. But then I went to have the chicken pot pie, and I was expecting a crisp, nice, tasty undercrust because the advertisement said no soggy undercrust. And it turns out that there was no undercrust. There was no undercrust, and therefore it could not be soggy undercrust. And that story has to do with the World Trade Center, that I don't want to say that people might say, yes, they're saying there was no defective heat retardant insulation on those beams. That is indeed true, because there was no heat retardant insulation. I've had a wonderful time in my life. I look back at many events and so on, and there are just certain things that you wonder about. The world is changing, and one of the things that's changing is that I think that you will never see another building like the World Trade Center tower ever being built. People don't need to be that together that much. The internet has taken, we meet virtually. Society is changing. I've had a wonderful time in my life. My engineering career has been very fascinating. I've been thrilled to be around so many talented students over my entire professional working career. In the time since I retired in 1998, my wife and I, we developed a national program whereby we are able to permit children with disabilities to learn how to ride bikes. And to date, we've had about well over 30,000 children with disabilities, with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, and autism are the three major disabilities, have mastered bike riding, an event that would never be even have been considered possible before. And one other thing that I've done many other things, but another thing I've done is to do an analysis of the causation of the Earth's ice ages. And with that, it's been a wonderful life. Had a wonderful time. And I'd love to entertain any inquiries that you might have. Thank you.